All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. Today, we're going to unpack the sprawling, multi-decade history of the Vietnam War, and we're going to do it using cold, hard data and historical milestones. Now, if you're joining me, you likely already know the broad strokes of this Cold War conflict. But today, we're going strictly by the numbers, the strategies, and the timeline that drove the actual mechanics of this proxy war. Before we even touch the politics, just wrap your head around that duration for a second. 19 years, 5 months, and 29 days, spanning from November 1955 all the way to April 1975, the sheer tragic scale of this conflict is absolutely staggering. This wasn't just some brief military engagement. It was a defining generational event. We are talking about almost 2 full decades of continuous warfare that completely upended the geopolitical landscape of Southeast Asia and, quite frankly, transformed domestic attitudes all across the globe. So to make sense of this geopolitical tidal wave, we've organized our explainer into 5 highly digestible chronological chapters: a divided Vietnam, the American escalation, the Tet Offensive, Vietnamization and exit, and finally, the devastating human cost. Let's start right at the beginning. Chapter 1, a divided Vietnam. We really have to highlight the sheer asymmetry of this Cold War proxy conflict. The fault lines were drawn incredibly clearly. On one side, you have the Communist North, led by Ho Chi Minh, along with the Viet Cong insurgency, and they are heavily backed by the Soviet Union and China. On the exact opposite side, you have the Republic in the South, led by Ngo Dinh Diem, who is being propped up financially and militarily by the United States and its anti-communist allies. It was your classic, high-stakes Cold War standoff, and it was rapidly heating up into a bloody civil war. What's absolutely wild here is just how early the North Vietnamese established a hidden network to covertly fuel that southern insurgency. As early as 1958, North Vietnam actually pushed into neighboring Laos to establish what famously became known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And listen, this wasn't just some simple dirt path in the woods. It was a sprawling, highly effective logistical artery deliberately designed to bypass the heavily guarded demilitarized zone, allowing them to pump vital supplies and troops directly to the Viet Cong fighters in the south. That sets the stage perfectly for Chapter 2, the American escalation. Things escalate incredibly fast, pulling the U.S. deeper and deeper into the quagmire. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy ramps up involvement by deploying thousands of military advisors to assist the South Vietnamese army. But the southern government was highly unstable, which culminated in a 1963 U.S.-backed military coup where President Diem was killed. The real point of no return, though, that hits in 1964. Following the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the U.S. Congress passes a resolution giving President Lyndon B. Johnson sweeping authority to increase the military presence without ever formally declaring war. The floodgates were literally wide open. And if you want to talk about a terrifying jump in scale, we go from a few thousand advisors in the early 60s skyrocketing to over 500,000 American boots on the ground at the war's peak in April 1969. 500,000! In just a matter of years, the American military apparatus had effectively taken over primary combat operations. So what happens when those forces actually meet? It's a total clash of strategies. The United States leaned heavily on its massive technological and industrial advantages. We're talking total air supremacy, heavy bombing campaigns like Operation Rolling Thunder, and huge ground operations focused on heavily armed search and destroy missions. Conversely, the communist forces knew for a fact they couldn't win a conventional war of attrition against American industry, so they relied on guerrilla warfare. They blended into the rural population, utilized the dense jungle for concealed bases, and executed hit-and-run attacks that totally negated the American technological edge. Which brings us to our explosive turning point, Chapter 3, the Tet Offensive. It's early 1968, and communist forces under the command of Lê Duan launch a massive, highly coordinated surprise attack known as the Tet Offensive. They hit over 100 cities and outposts simultaneously across South Vietnam. It completely shattered the illusion that the communist forces were somehow on the verge of defeat, bringing brutal, intense combat directly into urban centers that were previously considered completely secure. The paradox here is honestly striking. It is a fascinating study in military history. Because on the actual battlefield, the Tet Offensive was a crushing tactical defeat for the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. They suffered massive casualties and failed to hold any major cities. However, that battlefield loss translated into a massive strategic and political victory. The shocking imagery of this offensive was broadcast directly into living rooms around the world, completely fracturing American public support. It proved the war was far from over, dramatically increased domestic opposition, and ultimately forced President Johnson to slam the brakes on any further American military escalation. Following that shockwave, we enter Chapter 4, Vietnamization and Exit. The U.S. is now desperately trying to de-escalate their own ground involvement by shifting the combat burden squarely onto the South Vietnamese. President Nixon dubbed this policy Vietnamization. The objective was pretty straightforward on paper: systematically withdraw American troops while simultaneously pouring resources into expanding and equipping the South Vietnamese army so they could defend themselves against the North. But those final years were incredibly chaotic and incredibly volatile. In 1970, a coup in Cambodia results in a North Vietnamese invasion, which in turn pulls U.S. and South Vietnamese forces into a controversial counter-invasion, violently expanding the war's borders. Then, in 1972, the North launches the massive conventional Easter Offensive, barely repelled thanks to devastating U.S. air support during the linebacker operations. By 1973, the Paris Peace Accords are finally signed, allowing the last American combat forces to leave. But the peace was fragile. Weakened by corruption and an economic crisis, South Vietnam eventually collapses, and Saigon ultimately falls to North Vietnamese forces on April 30, 1975. The war was over. To truly grasp the magnitude of this explainer, we have to look at Chapter 5, the devastating human cost. When you just let the cold, hard numbers speak for themselves, the tragedy is honestly overwhelming. It devastated multiple nations across all of Indochina. The United States lost over 58,000 service members. But when we look at the regional impact, the numbers are almost incomprehensible. Estimates for total Vietnamese deaths, and we're talking both military and civilian here, range anywhere from just under 1 million to upwards of 3 million lives lost. Furthermore, the war's expansion destabilized neighboring countries, contributing to hundreds of thousands of deaths in Cambodia and tens of thousands more in Laos. And the devastation for sure wasn't limited just to immediate casualties. Beyond the bullets and the bombs, think about this. 20% of South Vietnam's entire jungle ecosystem was subjected to chemical defoliation by the U.S. military. They primarily used toxic herbicides like Agent Orange to literally strip away the jungle canopy and deny the Viet Cong their concealed bases. That drastic measure led to absolutely catastrophic long-term ecological damage and severe health problems for both the Vietnamese population and the American veterans who were exposed to it. So, as you reflect on these staggering metrics, the immense scale of destruction, and the timeline we've walked through together today, I want to leave you with one final, haunting question to consider. How do we measure the true legacy of a conflict that redraws borders, claims millions of lives, and reshapes global foreign policy for generations? Thank you for walking through this data with me today. Keep asking questions, keep looking at the facts, and I'll see you in the next explainer.